All right, thanks, Nadezhda. Yeah, so I'm very happy that I can present some of the results that we have done on the optimal control of superconducting qubits here. The results that I'll be talking about is mainly results that we published in these two papers that you see right here, which happened actually back then when we were working at the IBM Research Laboratory in Zurich, together also with the theory team from Saarland University, which has recently moved to the FZ Jülich. And we are now moved to TU Munich. So that's that. Okay. So first of all, I want to briefly talk about the quantum computing roadmap here. So the goal is since a couple of years to build computers based on quantum physics that can solve problems that are otherwise intractable. And there's really three main points on this roadmap here that are commonly discussed. There's the small scale aspect, which is where most of what I will be presenting today will be taking place in, where we do research level presentations with small qubit systems. You can see here 5 to 8 qubits. We can test here chemistry and error correction principles, and we try and build up the infrastructure and the community of quantum computing. There has been also some medium scale experiments by now. So examples would be, for instance, the Google group or some processors that IBM is actually making accessible in the cloud, and also recently in China there has been experiments that even show some advantage of using these quantum processors in some specific problems. And then the last point is where we want to go, which is large-scale quantum computing. And here we are really talking about orders of 10 to the 5 or 10 to the 6 qubits, where even multiple qubits are interconnected to form logical qubits that have full error corrections and can be used for factoring problems or quantum molecular simulations. The challenges, of course, are the scalability of the research level demonstrations that we have currently. And we have to establish control and build large systems with sufficient coherence to then move over the medium scale devices to the large scale quantum computing devices. Today, I want to really focus on research level demonstrations here. Everything I'll be looking at today will be happening on 1 or 2 qubit chips. So we are looking mainly at how to do control of qubits in an optimal manner, and also how to efficiently read out the quantum processing units. So let's look at one of those processors in detail and see what kind of components we have on these qubit chips usually. So what you see zoomed in here is the resonator part of these qubit chips, and we use qubit resonators for readout and control of qubits actually. So these resonators are actually simple harmonic oscillator structures and can be used even as multi-quantum buses. So you could couple multiple qubits to those and do readout on them. The second part that we have on these qubit chips here is, of course, the qubits. And to build those, we adapt this harmonic oscillator circuits at the bottom here and add a nonlinear Josephson junction element, and that changes the energy landscape that you can see down here from a landscape where the transition frequencies are the same for each of the transitions of the levels to and introduces an anharmonicity where then you could use individual transitions here as your qubit subspace. So usually we encode the qubit in the ground and the first excited state of these circuits here, which gives us a transition frequency of about 5 gigahertz. We can get to relaxation times on the order of 100 microseconds. That has been fairly standard in the field right now. And also coherence time are in the same order here. What is important, of course, is that with qubit frequencies on these orders, so at 5 gigahertz, we arrive at a temperature limit of about 240 millikelvin, which means that we do need to cool these qubit chips significantly, such that we are that we don't suffer from errors that arise due to thermal excitations that would arise from the heating of these chips. And to achieve that, we host these qubits in these dilution refrigerator units. So here you can see a schematic, and the structure on the right is actually these dilution refrigerators. On the right here, you can also see a real-life picture of those. And these essentially work as multiple stage refrigerators. So where each of these stages is cooled iteratively down to lower and lower temperatures. So you can see we start at 40 Kelvin here and move over some stages until we arrive at the stage which holds the qubits actually at about 10 millikelvin in temperature. To control then these qubit chips that are hosted down here, we feed the control and readout lines through all of these stages, but they are subsequently thermalized. And this lets us introduce control signals that we can play from these microwave controller racks here. And we now in the lab here at the WMI, we base this completely out of Zurich Instruments microwave sources, which are in turn programmed by a typical lab computer. So, and this can even be hosted in the cloud, as is demonstrated, for instance, in the IBM quantum experience. And then you can control your pulse sequences and your gates that you would want to play on your quantum computer, play them over your microwave stack and apply them to the qubit chip in your dilution refrigerator. So to get a little bit more in detail on these readout structures. So here you can see the same picture I showed you before with a bit of more detail on how these readout resonators look on the actual chip. And also I've written down here the qubit dispersive Hamiltonian that we use to gauge the qubit state. So what you can see here in this Hamiltonian is that the resonance frequency of the resonator circuit is actually dependent on the internal state of the qubit. And in frequency space, then you would see a picture that looks like this on the right here. So depending on the internal state of your qubit that is coupled to the resonator, the resonance frequency would shift in frequency space. So to probe the internal state of your qubit, all you would do is you would probe this resonator structure at a given frequency, and depending on the internal state of the qubit, you would either have high transmission for, in this case, the ground state, or low transmission for if the qubit is in the excited state. That way, you can distinguish the two states of the qubit. Exactly. So to do quantum measurements on actual experiments that we do, a typical measurement routine would look like this. So first of all, there's this idle time that we have to include in order to initialize the qubit in the ground state. And from here, we would then apply control operations, go into a bit more detail on that later. And depending on this control operation, we would end up in some different qubit state. And then we apply this measurement that I just showed you, which is projective in this case. So we will, with probability of the outcome of the measurement, project in either the ground or excited state, and simultaneously be able to measure the internal qubit state here. After we're done, we reset the qubit again by this idle time and start again. So, and then the qubit operation that we apply can be anything. We can even iterate different ones, that depends very much on the experiments that you would want to do. The point that I want to make here is that actually the time scale for this reset by T1 decay here that we have to use is actually a big waste of time. So to reset the qubit to the ground state with high probability, we would need to wait about 5 times of the D1 time, which I showed you before is on the orders of hundreds of microseconds, which in comparison to qubit operations or even measurement, these are typically on single microsecond scale only. And this is the simple reason that with the operations and measurement, you want to stay well below the T1 time. But for reset, you actually want to do a multiple of the T1 time reset to actually end up in a ground state with high probability. So to avoid this downtime that we have here to the qubit reset, we use a method that was first introduced in this paper that you can see up here, which suggests that you can rapidly speed up your measurement routine by omitting the qubit reset here and just use the final state or the projected state of your previous measurement as an input state for your subsequent circuit. And of course, there's some implications from this that you need to take into account in your data analysis. And this is actually what we further investigated, and we found some issues with that we managed to solve and extend this method quite a bit, actually. So to give you an idea what happens here, you can imagine that depending on the qubit operation that you do here, you would statistically create a mixture of final states. So your final state is essentially randomized, which means that for each individual measurement, you would have a probability to start either from the ground or excited state of the qubit, which is fine if you do know what state you ended up with, which you do know from the previous measurements. But there's actually some subtle differences depending on what qubit state you start out with. And one of these is obvious if you, first of all, the measurement signal you would recreate then using simply in the standard way, you would gauge how often you move away from your ground state. And here now you're compared to your actual previously measured state. Now coming back to the differences when you start in the different qubit states. What you see here is state preparation and measurement characterizations. So if you are not familiar with this, don't focus on these diagrams here. What we measure essentially is the purity of how well we can prepare and measure as the ground state as well as the excited state here. And we compare here the initialization of the qubit in the ground state or in the excited state. So you can see, if you just focus on these the right plots here, that the spam error here, so state preparation measurement, is increased by a lot if you actually initialize the qubit in the excited state. And this is just owed to the fact that you now have non-zero idle times in which your qubit can decay, and that way you increase the accuracy in how you can prepare these different states. Now, this is in general not a problem. You can compensate for spam errors very easily by doing a lot of statistics of your measurements and then just calibrating these errors out. But where this becomes a problem is actually now if you do this restless measurements. To illustrate this, here we can look at a gate sequence which measures here a couple of times the identity gate, so not doing nothing to your qubit and just measuring the outcome, and then measuring the same amount of times a bit flip gate. And now what you see here is the signals that you would get without correcting for errors for the different approaches. So if you initialize your qubit in the excited state, you get a different signal than when you initialize your qubit in the ground state. Now, this in itself is not a problem, but now if you also plot the probability to initialize the different states here I plot the probability to initialize in 0, you can see that this is not constant. And this is simply due to the fact that during these idle times, we have a finite probability to actually decay to the ground state. So as you repeat these identity gates here, the qubit becomes more and more likely to be initialized in the ground state if you don't compensate for this. And a similar effect we see here actually for the bit flip gates. You see now we don't, the trend is not going to a ground state population, but rather we converge to a completely mixed probability to either get the ground or excited state here. And if you just now apply these signal analysis that I showed before, you would get a distortion in your signal, which is exactly a rescaling or a weighted mean of these two different signals that you would expect, which weighted by the probability to initialize either of these states. Okay, because by explaining it like this, you can probably guess the solution. So what we implemented now to fix this is simply by independently processing data by their corresponding initial state. And this way we can compensate for spam errors beforehand and get rid of these distortions. And we have shown this here in this recent paper, where we measure Rabi oscillation at 250-fold increased measurement rate. So we measure here 250 kilohertz data acquisition rate and are able to exactly reproduce the result of standard measurements with only a slightly elevated standard deviation of these individual measurement points. We have also measured randomized benchmarking, where we are limited to 50 kilohertz repetition rate only, but are similarly reproducing these results. All right, that's how we can efficiently do fast measurements. Now let's come to the optimal control part. And to give you an idea what is optimal control, I like to use this nice example, which is a bit far removed now, but it illustrates what optimal control actually means. And this is actually the, if you would want, so that's the NASA trajectory that was used to bring the Cassini probe into the orbit around Saturn. And you can see here, this is by no means a straight trajectory. So what you do here is you use prior knowledge about the system, which in this case is location and velocity of other bodies in the solar system, to calculate an efficient trajectory to get your probe close to Venus, and therefore efficiently or minimize the fuel usage that you would need on this trajectory. In superconducting qubits, we can use similar approaches for the control of qubits. So here we're coming back to the structure I showed in the beginning, which is this energy landscape of the qubit. We control these qubits by applying microwave pulses now. And you can see the corresponding Hamiltonian up here. So the microwave pulse drives a interaction between the ground state and the excited state of the qubit here. And to do a rotation of the between the 0 and the excited state of the qubit on the x-axis, for example, you would just have to apply a specific phase and an amplitude of your signal, and you would be able to calibrate an x-gate, what we call this bit flip. Now, in a real qubit, we have the problem of leakage into higher excited states. So you can see that the energy difference between the qubit subspace and the higher excited state is actually not super far removed. What we do want to do, since the computational subspace is reduced to the ground and excited state only, we never want to essentially leave this computational subspace. So we want to target this lower transition only and never target this transition into the higher states. So the first simple solution is to use Gaussian pulses to reduce the width in the frequency space of the control pulse. But we find that pretty close, we hit a limit here that this is not sufficient anymore. And a well-known optimal control solution for this in the community is actually the drag pulses. This has been first published already in 2009. The drag solution essentially adds a derivative into the quadrature component of your control pulse, which helps remove unwanted frequency at the corresponding higher order transition. And frequency spaces can be nicely illustrated like this. So if you imagine a slow pulse that aims to target only this transition of the qubit, then here you don't see any problem. The unwanted transition is far removed from any spectral component of the pulses, so you can nicely address your qubit transition. Now what happens if you move to fast pulses, of course, is that the frequency response broadens here. And that means that now you have actually a significant contribution that removes population of your computational subspace by targeting this excited state transition here. And this drag component that is added to this pulse here now has an effect that kind of looks like the blue curve here. So you would deterministically remove a certain part of your spectrum and therefore minimize the contribution of this unwanted transition here in order to minimize the leakage out of your computational subspace. So this is well known and very much applied in all kind of qubits experiments right now. And So of course we do know how to do this better. So in this analytic solution here, you do use a system approximation to arrive at this solution. So what you do is you disregard actually higher orders of this problem, or even of problems that you do not account for in this model that is used to derive this pulse shape. And opposite from that, so the other approach that is used mostly in numerical optimization is actually this breakdown of the pulse shape into piecewise constant samples here. So that means that for pixels of constant time, you would assign an amplitude value here that is informed by the analytic solution. And in numerical optimization, we are able to optimize each of these pixels now to arrive at a fully optimized pulse. And this way you can capture the full system dynamics of the qubit, maximize the degree of freedom according to your control devices, and fully utilize the control landscape that you are in control of. Of course, an experiment that is rather hard to do. So we're dealing with a very large parameter subspace here. So whereas in the analytic solution, we are dealing only with 3 parameters, so essentially the width, the amplitude, and the scaling of the correction here. Now we are dealing with these parameters plus a parameter for each of these samples here. But theory suggests that this yields quite the improvement. So what I'm showing here is the gate error that we expect from simulations versus the gate time. And you can see that for rather short gates, which is where we want to go to in order to outrun coherence times and also qubit decay times. First of all, the Gaussian performs very bad at all of these ranges already. And with the drag solution, you can improve that already quite a bit. But of course, if you take this more complicated solution, you're even able to improve on the drag pulses significantly still, which is why what motivated us here to also apply this technique and experiment. And in experiment now, we adapt this technique as well. We use every one of these pixels as an optimization parameter. And since now we are not able anymore to do parameter characterization and therefore a tune-up of these pulses in kind of one-dimensional fashion, where you, for instance, would tune up the amplitude and the frequency independent from each other and then iterate those. Here now the parameter space is so correlated that we have to simultaneously optimize all of them. And we use, for this here, this is just illustrated in a 2-dimensional subspace. For this, we use this covariance matrix adaptation optimizer, which works well on the experiment for various reasons, actually. So this operates by evaluating a bunch of points in the parameter space simultaneously on the experimental system, gauging the cost function that we receive back from here, which is in our case based on randomized benchmarking, and then adapts the parameters to move closer to the optimum in parameter space to hopefully in the end converge. So this optimizer that we use here has proven pretty noise resilient and is due to the usage of multiple points here, also pretty sensitive to correlations within these points. And thanks to this, to the restless measurements that I showed you before, we can rather fast measure a whole population of those points here, which lets us in turn run more complicated optimizations with larger parameter subspaces. So how this looks in experiment, if we let this optimizer run, here I plot the cost function versus the progress of the optimizer. So you can see we start here with the pure Gaussian parameterization, where all of the different pixels are not adapted at all. And then we let the optimizer decide the appropriate adaptation of these individual pixels. And now you can see as we let it run, we at some point converge, improve the figure of merit until we converge to an optimal solution that then returns us the optimized piecewise constant pulse. And we have done this optimization actually for a various pulse length here. You can see here in blue how the drag analytical solution squares up against the piecewise constants optimized pulses. So it is an area where we do not manage to improve much, which is the rather on the longer side of the pulses, but where we get into the region where we expect significant leakage, and we can observe that by the drop of the gate fidelity of the drag-based pulses, we managed to, with this approach, to improve the fidelities of the piecewise constant pulses to a level that is on par with what we have seen in the for longer pulses. So now we can move or go to much shorter pulses with virtually the same fidelity. There's still a discrepancy. So what you see up top here are the theory curves of what you would expect from just decoherence. And there's still some noise level that is introduced, which is adding to or subtracting from the gate fidelity here, which we can explain by different sources of noise, but don't fully understand yet. So now let's look at what we are doing here in the shortest most pulses, where we see the most dramatic improvement in pulse fidelity. And what the optimizer came up with is, you can see right here. So here you see in blue the initial pulses we started out with, and in red you see the adaptations that the optimizer has done to it. And you can see not much of the initial pulse shape is actually remaining here. But what you can also see on the right-hand side here, so what we plot here is, first of all, the population of the qubit remaining in the computational subspace. And on the bottom right here is also the ground state population. So this is randomized benchmarking, and this is a measure of the error within the computational subspace. And you can see here that if we compare again the drag pulses and the piecewise constant pulses, that we improve on both of these fronts here quite dramatically. Whereas we are not able to explain yet why this pulse actually improves. So we do not fully understand the components of these pulses here yet. If you're interested in more detail in this, we have also published this earlier this year, so you can look it up at this citation up here. And finally, I want to touch briefly on what we are planning to do next at the WMI. So we do know how to extend this method to 2 qubit gates. This is published in this paper here. So the idea here is it gets a lot more difficult to do 2 qubit gates in this manner because, as you can see here, the duration of these gates is rather on the order of hundreds of nanoseconds, whereas the single qubit gates are single nanoseconds only, like on the order of 4 or 5 nanoseconds. So the pixelization approach would very quickly let the parameter space explode and make the optimization much harder than with single qubit gates. What we tried in turn here is to come up with clever ways to instead parameterize these 2 qubit gates. We have tried here Fourier parameterizations and have tried to reduce the parameter number so that it becomes feasible in experiment, but have not yet seen an as dramatic improvement in 2 qubit gate fidelities. In the future, so we are moving to larger quantum systems. This is a project that we are doing on the intermediate timescale on the WMI. So here we are investigating also high frequency qubits. We are moving to, or we are investigating multi-qubit couplers that are supposed to not only allow for 2 qubit gates, but multi-qubit gates. And we are trying to build systems that are a bit larger in scale of what we are used to right now. One nice project that we're currently investigating, for instance, is a multi-qubit gate. So in this case, we're using a tunable coupling element to couple 3 qubits and try and implement 3 qubit gates. And if you're interested in that, I encourage you to look at a poster in the session with the name C5 here. And with that, I want to acknowledge my colleagues here at the WMI and also at IBM Research in Zurich, where most of this research has been done. And of course, also in collaboration with the colleagues in Yorktown. And if you are interested in our work, you can check out the WMY website for open positions in our institute. And with that, I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Max. I invite everybody to write their questions in our Slack channel. And I will start with a question. So I assume like for each qubit, you need to run this optimization separately, right? How much the final results of these parameters which you come up in the end is different between the qubits?
So very different. So one of these optimization runs here returns, also this is not a method that is feasible for day-to-day operations. So one of these runs is about 24 hours of optimization. So we use this rather as an information tool to learn more about the system, and then in turn use this to design more optimal pulses on the experiment rather than an actual tune-up of the experiment. And even if you tune up the same qubit twice, the parameters will not even be remotely alike. So I don't expect to apply pulses on one qubit to a different qubit until we have learned what we actually optimized here. So
okay, but if you use the same parameters you have derived at the end of one optimization, you use them constantly, then it works.
The pulses work for some time until the qubit or the system drifts out of the optimum that we have found. So this gate can be operated for some days after tune-up, yes. But even the time drifts of the qubit parameters will pretty soon move you out of this optimal point that you have found in one optimization.
Okay, thank you. We have a question. Can the PVC method be further improved by smoothly interpolating between the optimized grid points instead of the sharp transitions?
So actually the piecewise constant method assumes the highest resolution that we have on the instruments. Of course, the edges of these pulses are not as sharp as you see here. So there's low-pass filtering going on, which intrinsically smooths transition between these pixels here. But in the end, we are ultimately limited by the capabilities of the pulse of the arbitrary waveform generator that produces these pulses. And this limits the maximum resolution or the minimum resolution that we can define these piecewise constant samples at. So it's not like we could break this down 100-fold if we wanted to. This is actually at the limit of the hardware that we are using right now.
Okay, thank you. And with this, I suggest we move to the round tables and continue the discussion there. I want to thank Max for the presentation and everybody for attending, and see you at the next sessions and at the round table.
All right.